My name's Tanya Ahern. I'm with NCAR, the National Center for Advocacy and Recovery. We promote recovery, wellness through advocacy, education, and progressive policy initiatives that identify substance use as a public health concern, reduce stigma and its related harms, and foster a macro and micro level of systems change. If you're not familiar with us, you can go on our website. That's ncaa.org, and you can see some of the work that we do. We have a podcast. We have multiple trainings. We also will do like a training to whatever you're looking to do. We'll do trainings for anything, and we do advocacy spotlight and then the webinars. So welcome. There has been, we've talked about peers are a really kind of a hot subject in New Jersey, and we're actually pretty well known for having recovery centers in every county. And we've done a lot of work on peers, and so I really wanted to talk more. And there's been a little concern about legislation to try to change things with peers, and so we've been talking more about, you know, where we are as peers and where we're going as peers. And I think we all recognize the value of peers. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the overdose numbers have come down partly because of peers.
Sure.
It's harm reduction in peers. I see that more than those are the biggest changes that we've had in the industry. And I think they play a major part in what's happened with the overdose numbers coming down. So I don't know that everyone, maybe there isn't the data that people would like to see it, but we all know it. And we know that we're actually servicing thousands and thousands of individuals who use drugs and in recovery and with mental health, because I don't think we talk enough about the mental health peers. And so we're going to start with mental health peers and that history, because I think that that's one thing many of us that are here are probably involved more on the substance use side, but mental health has been around for a long time. Those peers
Okay.
have been around a lot longer than the rest of us. And so I asked Chrissy Scher to be part of this. And so Chrissy is, and I'll introduce them as I'm going to introduce everybody first. Chrissy's the director of the Consumer Connections for Mental Health Association in New Jersey and certified peer facilitator. So we're going to start with Chrissy, but I'll introduce everyone else. Patrick Roth um, is a MA's, I should know the initials, all these initials.
Uh,
Master,
MA. Yeah, but
Masters.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
in philosophy actually.
Okay. CPRS and director of training for the Roth Institute at CARES, and prevention is linked, or key. I'm sorry, prevention is key. Heather Ogden's the owner, founder of Artistic Recovery. Most of you know her as a trainer. She's been training forever. And out and she's involved in everything. And then Mike Santillo, many of you probably recognize Mike, who's been involved in everything as well. He's the co-founder of NJ Cars in the G-Star Coalition, which he'll talk about a little bit. He's a team lead. So I'm going to start with Chrissy, like I said, because I think mental health peers have been around a lot longer than the substance use peers, and Chrissy is really good about explaining the history of peers in general, maybe, and definitely in New Jersey. So, Chrissy, first of all, what led you to the peer work?
Oh goodness. This was not the original plan, as I think is with most of us. Um, that being said, I think I was always really interested in psychology. And in college, I took an introduction to psychiatric rehabilitation course on a whim, not really knowing what that was. And that's where I learned about mental health recovery. That's where I learned about peer support. It's where I learned about this idea that people with lived experience bring value to the field. And I was dealing with my own struggles at that time, although I hadn't really like done anything with that. I was very young and just kind of figuring things out. But after college, I ended up going and working at CSP&J, which when I talk about the history, they're kind of one of the biggest players in our local history. And I became fully engulfed in the peer world, and it really became the best parts of my life personally and professionally. And as my career evolved, so did my own journey. And I moved over to the Mental Health Association in New Jersey about 12 years ago and have been the director of consumer connections ever since.
Hmm.
Great. I know that you speak nationally on the history of peers. You do, I know that's a whole presentation. Is there anything, maybe a short, like brief history and maybe how we got where we are in New Jersey?
Yeah, I'll kind of focus on New Jersey, but in mental health peer support, really this came out of what we call the consumer survivor ex-patient movement of the 1960s and 70s, which really started with deinstitutionalization when state psychiatric hospitals all over the country started to close and people were moved into the community. That happened for a whole bunch of reasons that we don't have time to get into today. But what it did was it moved folks out of institutionalization and into the community. Um, and when that happened, there were some good intentions around community-based care, but the infrastructure wasn't there. So people started organizing and providing mutual aid to one another. And that's a lot of the early roots of what we would consider our modern peer movement in mental health. So here in New Jersey, we really saw this happen. Peer workers really start to emerge in as early as the 1980s. I mentioned I worked for CSP and J Collaborative Support Programs of New Jersey for a long time, and they were essentially one of the earliest players in this. They had a statewide network of self-help centers, now called community wellness centers, that are just peer-run drop-in spaces that were really, you know, places where recovery was being talked about, where people were helping each other. Um, and that was this huge, large scale like infrastructure that was happening in New Jersey, as I said, as early as the 80s. And the way peer support and mental health evolved in New Jersey is interesting because this was all happening, but we didn't have formal peer training. We didn't have any credentials. So the workforce pre-exists all of that by quite a bit of time. So it created some interesting challenges. Um, by the early 1990s, the Mental Health Association was starting to train peers. Um, we became a named program funded by the division in 1997. So we're approaching 30 years of doing peer training. Um, but as I mentioned, the interesting piece is that work was starting well before that. In the early 2000s, under Governor Cody, mental health was a very specific focus of his, and he led a transformation of our system from a medical model to a wellness and recovery model. And by 2008, we had peers working in psychiatric screening in all of our state hospitals on ICMS teams, PACT teams, outreach roles. The Mental Health Association had post teams, which were peer outreach support teams. So we had all of these people working in peer positions. At the time, they were called consumer providers. Um, but we didn't get a credential, the CRSP credential, until 2011. So there's kind of this gap on the mental health side of things where there's an awful lot of peer workers who have tons of experience working in the field. They've been through training, but many of them never got credentialed. So that's kind of an interesting piece of the history there. Um, because we had this deeply established workforce before the credential ever existed on the mental health side of
Right.
things. Um, so I think that that's just kind of a bit of the history.
So it's interesting because I know, well, so there's a big difference in the length of time or, what goes into the CRISP training, which,
Mhm.
versus what goes into the mental health, the substance use training, right? I mean, it's a lot of training that's required and it's a little bit different than the peers. Would it, like, maybe explain a little bit the
Sure.
difference?
So the CRSP, which is the Certified Recovery Support Practitioner, that is our state's mental health peer support credential. And there are a lot of similarities, which I'll start with between that and CPRS, right? Both peer credentials. And it really, looking at the two of them, the way I like to think of it is I like to think of it as number one, how do you identify? And number two, where do you hope to work? And those things coupled together will kind of tell you which path to choose. Many peers end up getting both. because they plan to really work in a lot of co-occurring spaces. They're co-occurring themselves. But for the CRSP, we are primarily mental health. So the self-identification is of being a person in mental health recovery yourself. And then the required training is the Consumer Connections Core Training, which is 84 hours of curriculum. You also must go through a RAP Seminar 1 workshop. That is it's a short training. It's 16 hours. But that's Wellness Recovery Action Planning, and that is a wellness self-management tool. And then just like the CPRS, you also must have 500 hours of work experience.
Yeah, and someone just asked, actually, I forgot to tell you, I'll go to the question and answer area for your questions, and then we'll go through the questions and I'll ask them as as they fit the conversation, and we'll make sure we get answers for everyone. That's okay. Sorry, don't worry about it. Asking, I didn't tell you. But I think so. It's a good question though. Like, how do you get the training?
Right. So it's called the core training, and we offer it at Consumer Connections. Currently, we're funded to offer it 3 times a year. And it is virtual. Oh goodness, our next application period opens in July. We just had one close. I can get, once we move on to someone else, I can get our link to get on our mailing list, and I can add that to the chat, or,
Perfect.
we're similar. I can get it to you guys. But that's the best way, is to get on our mailing list, and then get connected with us.
Perfect. Thank you. So I was going to go to Patrick about the certification for substance use peers, but I might go to Mike first. And it's this conversation, it's funny because I put questions out to everyone, but as we were getting ready for the webinar, we realized that these questions are, it's all going to happen with just a conversation with everyone. So I wanted to start with Mike, just because Patrick had said something. And Mike, you can tell a little bit about how you got involved, but I do, if anyone doesn't know, I mean, Mike was running the first recovery center, substance use recovery center in the state for a while, Eva's Village, which is still around. But Mike, how did you get involved, and how did you get to Eva's?
Yeah. Well, when Chrissy was telling a story about the mental health, it brought back a lot of memories because the mental health folks were way ahead of us, both in terms of the community and the treatment programs, the support programs. So actually, my first kind of awareness of peers was a program that the Division of Addiction Services, right? So this is before the Division of Addiction Services merged with the Division of Mental Health Services to form the Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services. And I think it was 2003, 2005, put out a program called the Recovery Mentor Program. And I think it was in response to what the mental health folks were doing. It was actually it was a great initiative. They were really looking to get peers, although we didn't call them peers at that point, to get peers really integrated into the treatment, all the treatment programs in New Jersey. Guess what? The treatment programs weren't ready for it, and the recovery community wasn't ready for it. The program just fell apart. So, but it did start to get my interest in, like, what is this? What are recovery mentors, and what is all this? So I started to do my own research, and it wasn't until about 2008 or 2009. And you have to remember, at that point, I was actually the clinical director at EVA's. We were one of the largest treatment programs in New Jersey at that time. And what I was doing was I was looking at our outcomes, right? Because I was supervising all these clinical services, clinical clinicians. And I'm going to be honest with you, like, our outcomes weren't looking that great. And it wasn't just us. It was across the board. And I thought, God, there's got to be a better way to do this. We've got to figure out ways to improve outcomes. And this idea of integrating peers into our treatment continuum of care became a very interesting concept to me. So basically, we're talking about a recovery-oriented system of care. So that whole kind of idea became really, for me, a driver in the way that I thought, in the way that I wanted to start to implement programs. So around that same time, the division, I think at that point they may have merged, but maybe not. The division maybe of addiction services put out an RFP for the first recovery community center. And you got to realize that in 2008, first of all, nobody, maybe a small handful of people, maybe some folks at NCAD, which is now NCAR, but very few people even knew what a recovery community center was. Fewer people probably knew what a recovery-oriented system of care was or is. We take it for granted now because everybody knows what it is. There were no peer recovery specialists, although they did exist in Pennsylvania, and I think I could talk to you about the origin of that term and how that came about. But mostly we called peers at that time were either mentors or recovery coaches. So there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of resistance. Yeah. No, I don't want to make too much of a, like there weren't people protesting or anything, but there was a lot of pushback from the treatment community who kind of thought we were trying to replicate treatment programs, but use peers instead of clinicians. And of course, that's not what a recovery community center is all about. And then, believe it or not, there was a lot of pushback from the recovery community. Because at that time, really, the recovery community was really just 12-step programs. Yeah. And of course, I love 12-step programs. It's what saved my life. And, I support the 12-step fellowship. But there was a lot of pushback because they were kind of like, wait a minute, you're copying what we're doing. And these recovery coaches sound a lot like sponsors, So there was a lot of education that we had to do internally, a lot of education that we had to do in the community. Thank God we had a resource, William White. So if anybody doesn't know who William White, I think everybody knows who he is now. But thank God we had that resource because he had already written about the differences between recovery coaches and clinicians and case managers and sponsors. So we had that information that we could draw on and we could use to educate the community. But it started to catch on pretty quickly. And as I said, NCAD, which is now NCAR, and we were talking earlier about Aaron Chikursky, was one of the key players that helped us get the word out there. The first conference that I participated in NCAD sponsored, and Aaron was the, I guess, MC or host of that event. And over time, the movement kind of grew and more people got involved. But at that time, there was no certification, there was no training for peers on the SUD side. And we actually drew on the Consumer Connection folks when that certification did come out, and they were doing some training for us. But most of the training we did internally. So, there was no workforce. We had to build our own workforce. We had to train our own workforce, and we had to, really work to educate the community. And it did become a way of starting to build that recovery community. I think it's important to just say that for most of us, it wasn't just about peers, and it wasn't just about recovery community centers or programs. We really, and it's why it was exciting. It was an exciting time, and probably the most exciting time in my career. Even though I was like a clinician, 20 years I had already been a clinician, but it was probably the most exciting time in my life because we really were looking at changing the system. We all felt like the system didn't work. We weren't serving people with substance use disorder the way they should be treated, the way they needed to be treated, the way they needed to be supported. And we were really looking to change the system. It was much
I think
just advocating for peer services.
Yeah, and I think, probably we should have had Aaron on this as well, Aaron Kacharsky on, because Aaron did really push the whole movement. We brought in anonymous people, right? And I joined I was an advocate with NCAR in 2012, I guess. And that's really when they started the whole Anonymous People movie, and we were taking it everywhere and showing it everywhere.
Yeah.
Where, coming out of the basements of churches and talking about recovery and being open about talking about recovery. So it did change how people were looking at things and open it up. And I know Patrick, we talked a little bit about Aaron too, right? Because
Yeah.
that was a big
Yeah.
part of you getting involved in things. So I want to kind of go to question about that with
Yeah.
you. Like, we want to just talk about how you got involved.
Yeah. Well, I started as a clinician as well. So from my own recovery experience, I did my own recovery experience starting in 2006. I became a clinician in Ocean County, right? And by 2012, 2013, the opioid epidemic was just screaming across New Jersey, and ground zero tended to be Ocean County, Seaside Heights, Toms River. And so there was a lot of meetings between people to try to figure out what to do for all the people falling through the cracks. Because again, like Mike said, we were feeling the treatment system we had was not serving people in the best way we could, punitive and mandated treatment and such. And I was getting disillusioned with the clinical work. I got invited to become the recovery advocate by Don Holcomb at DEMOS at that time, and I became the grant monitor actually for EVAs and Living Proof, and that's how I met Heather. And but before that, I actually went to an NJPN conference, and I did a workshop. Mike was putting on a workshop, and he talked about EVAs, and I never forget this story about some guy coming in. He just wanted to come in and clean the floors, maybe clean the bathrooms for a while, and like didn't want anything to do with getting sober. And then within 6, 7 months, he started to be like interested in getting. And I was like, this is how we help people. And then with Aaron taught me so much because I joined that recovery advocate program right around the same time you did, Tanya. And I met a bunch of people there. That's where I met Christina Fagan, we wound up. Then we got the idea to create CARES. CARES was like the first independent, peer-run, peer-driven recovery center. We were independent from any treatment center, and so I was really interested in trying to figure out how to do this. And then William White comes along, right? And so I got immersed in that, and I was doing a lot of research. And the division at the time was looking to create a peer credential, and so was the CERT board, and they were kind of not getting along at the time, really. And so, yeah, that's how I got wrapped in it myself. That's kind of how I started with that, yeah. And I actually met Pat Deegan. I went to one of her talks, and she was brilliant. She blew my mind. Peggy Swarbuck blew my mind from CPSNJ, and I just was trying to figure out something to do to make a difference. It was kind of, I really want to help people. I don't think what we're doing right now is helping people, especially with the opioid crisis. So, and we were one of the people that went up to Connecticut, did CCAR. We were implementing CCAR at CARES, the Recovery Coach Academy. And that's the first things I started to train was CCAR, yeah. Until later on I got asked to do the credential.
So, and Mike mentioned about the pushback, right? I mean, some of the
There was
pushback on peers, right?
my early trainings was the 12-stepper. This 12-step community was not very friendly to multiple pathways.
Yeah. And it was difficult. Well, and it was also difficult because, I mean, the 12 steps like kind of in treatment. Well, I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of the treatment programs refer to 12 steps, and so it became almost, sometimes I felt like the peer movement was, there was a lot of pushback because everyone thought we were trying to replace something.
Yes.
And it wasn't about replacing. And I remember, and I don't know if you remember this, but I remember this very well, is that we asked you to come and speak. And we should speak down
Cape
in,
May.
you remember, in May County. And I was
I
sitting
was
in the audience at the time, and there were all these clinicians behind me who I think half of them left at the half point, at the half point of the conference
I
because they were so mad at you.
They
because
were, yeah.
just it was just a different way to think about things, and really you were talking a little bit about harm reduction before harm reduction was being talked about too,
Yeah, I was. Yeah.
using peers, and it was a very difficult very difficult to get people to understand that
Yeah.
this wasn't in lieu of treatment. This was supportive
Yeah.
of individuals and actually helped treatment. So
Yeah.
it took a
I was a little
while.
provocative back then
You
too.
were provocative. I mean,
I
I
think
loved it. It
I had
was
a
fun.
I had a PowerPoint slide and I think it said urine because I was just trying to say what is success in treatment? Urine screen. Compliance was another. What makes
Yeah,
someone
he was
sober? Yeah,
provocative for
I was a little
sure.
provocative back then.
I mean, just to reinforce that, the other day I went because I want to kind of reflect on what was it like because I don't remember, what I did yesterday, let alone, 18 years ago. And I was looking at some of my early PowerPoints because they're like kind of a cognitive time box,
Yeah.
of what you were thinking. So I had presentations at that time were like, 12 slides. The last two slides were the recovery center slides. The first 10 were five about how our current system doesn't work, and the other five were how like a recovery oriented system of care could improve what we're doing. So as Patrick kind of said, it really was about trying to change the system.
Yeah,
Right.
it was.
And so, yeah, and so Heather was involved. She got involved in NCARB at the same time as me.
Right.
Um, and then and actually I've said this before in other presentations, is like when I got involved in NCAR, I was a family member. I didn't even know what recovery was about. I didn't even know it existed. So the recovery community really taught me all about recovery because I just knew about the struggle, right? That my son struggled. I did not know about recovery. So I learned from all of you, which was pretty awesome to get that education. It definitely changes me as a family member, to get that information from all of you. But I met Heather, through NCAR because or NCAT at the time, but she also was an advocate, but she was an advocate in recovery. So, she got involved pretty quickly in this whole peer movement. In fact, I remember every single time we went to testify at budget hearings, there was Heather. A recovery center in every county. Like, I mean, this is what she testified for from the very beginning. So, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about like how you got involved, Heather, and then we'll go back into how we got the certification.
So how I got involved is a little different. I'm a peer. We just didn't call us that then. Like I was just a person with lived experience, and I think people going into the field now understand this a lot more than they did when I first started. But I had a radically different career before I ever came into this field. But what had happened was I got into recovery and I had pretty much like every privilege you could think of for a person going into recovery. Like I had good insurance, I went to a great treatment facility, I didn't lose my partner, I didn't lose my kids. Like I was very very privileged, and it was still so hard to maintain my recovery. And I was like, if it's this hard for me with all of this like stuff and good things that I still have in my life, like what is it like for the people that don't have the resources that I have? And I was very active in my recovery community. I did a lot of like I was very very big on the social part of it because I found that people could connect socially even if they couldn't connect in meetings or in a program, or like I saw that benefit of community very early on. But I also had my own lived experience. I had mental health issues well before I ever went near a substance. So I went into my recovery knowing that that was a large role, would have to play a large role. I would have to approach recovery on two fronts. And when I spoke about that in my existing circles back then, I was silenced and I was chastised for it. That's not something we talk about here. And I said, okay, well, if we can't talk about that here, then we need a place to talk about it. So I did some research and found It was a dual recovery meeting. Now, keep in mind, folks that are watching this, like the terminology has changed immensely since 2010, 2011 is the time period I'm talking about. So when I first came around, we were still calling them MICA meetings. And even back then, I was like, I am never calling anything a MICA meeting. That is a terribly stigmatizing term. For those of you that may not know, that's mentally ill, chemically addicted. That was what we termed our dual meetings back then. But I found a type of meeting that, if you printed out the paperwork, you could run it. And then I went from there. So that was just my personal experience. But it was through those meetings that I met somebody. I was actually sponsoring her and became very, very close with her family. Her family worked in the field. Okay. Her stepmother actually worked in the field. And she told me about these really cool things called recovery centers that were starting in New Jersey. And that I should look to see when they would be hiring for these recovery centers, because I would probably be a good fit as a peer in this new structure. So at the time, the only one that existed was Eva's Village. But while I was having these conversations, there was another one in the pipeline, and that would become Living Proof Recovery Center in Voorhees. So when it did pop up, I did apply, I did get the job. I started as a part-time administrative assistant with zero background clinical experience except my psych stuff that I took in college. But we got to build this program, and it was in that role that I met Patrick when he was working at DeMoss as the advocate. I met Mike because Mike, and shout out to Cindy Marie, who was back at Eva's back then too. They came all the way down from Patterson to Voorhees to work with me and John and Lataya and give us some of the background on here's what to do, here's what not to do. I was working with the same woman who had told me about this recovery center thing. She was into what we now look at as a different kind of recovery coaching. So she actually does companion sober coaching. So that's something that we don't talk about a lot in our peer movement because it's a very different format. But she had introduced this recovery model and this peer model into a much larger audience. And there were people at CFS who did a really good job in building up the program. But it was a tough sell. And I felt like I was kind of getting it on all ends because here I was like the lived experience in the room, but I did not have any kind of actual authority. I was just kind of there. And then on the other hand, I was very involved in my own personal recovery community, and they were very puzzled by it as well. So that is actually when I started doing what would become trainings later on, because I was constantly explaining things to different groups of people and trying to explain the benefits of the peer movement. And of course, it was in that job I did meet Aaron, and that's when my, already inherent kind of inner advocate really had some place to focus. Plus, I had already had this experience up to this point of getting resistance about being open about my mental health struggles, and it gave me the ability to really kind of bring all that together in one place. So having the advocacy framework right at the time that this movement was starting to become a movement, some of us knew it was a movement, but most people did not. So doing a lot of education and yes, learning how to advocate and testify to get the funding for these, because I learned very quickly that without the funding, it's not going to go anywhere. So you have to ask for the funding in order for that to happen.
Yeah, and I think, so I'm going to go back to Patrick because Patrick was involved with the division at the time, right? And this is when the ORP started.
Yes.
Right. And that was a big part of the history as well, is the creation of the ORP, the opioid overdose response program. So you want to talk about what happened with the peers at that point?
Well, I was in the meetings creating the ORP grant, so I was sitting in those meetings, and then of course I was, in my mind, I'm like, we have to train these folks. We have to train these folks to be peers. They can't just walk in because they have lived experience. You have to learn how to use it. And so there was DMOS was trying to put together a training for with Rutgers to train the peers. We were under the gun because there was a timeline, and the first ORPs were going to roll out in Ocean County, and there was no training for a variety of reasons. So Connie Green down in Ocean County called us up and said, "Can you come down and just teach us CCAR?" Because at that point, CCAR was around. Um, we called it the Wild West. Actually, the Serpo was, and DMOS were calling it kind of the Wild West because people were getting certified as recovery coaches, but there was no oversight. There was no ethical kind of standards, and it was kind of like a lot of people just doing, out of the goodness of their heart, but detoxing people on their couches and doing all these kind of things. And so we were asked to come down and train CCAR because there was nothing else at the time. At that point, the CERT board was pushing to write a credential to be the companion of the CRSP, right? So we have the CRSP for mental health. Let's do one for substance use. And so they gave me the RIC and RC PR credential. And I was actually, at that point, CARES had been established. And the CERT board, Rich Boat, had reached out to Chris Goki, the director here at CARES. And then I had known him back and forth for a variety of reasons, and he asked me to write the credential. And I wrote the credential. I was accepted by the CERT board. I wrote it from January to June in 2016, started training it in July, and that became the credential for the CERT board. But there was no funding because for a variety of reasons again. And so we had to charge for that. But we wound up getting grants right away from CVS and so on. And that became the state credential, the CPRS. And at the time, it was the only one for a while. It was the only one for about 3 years. And that's how I met Chrissy. We trained MHA in it. I trained Heather to be. Did a TOT with Heather to do the training. I was all over the state. It was crazy. I was everywhere. I was in Bergen County and Cape May County, and we started to license out the training, do TOTs. So Living Proof was doing the CPRS at the time, and MHA was doing the CPRS, and community colleges eventually. I wrote a course for Ocean County College, Camden County College. Rowan University is currently training it as a course. And so that just kind of got the ball rolling, and really was the impetus was the urgency of the ORP, the ORP program, where we go into the hospital's bedside after someone's been Narcaned, and to train people for that, because they were going to roll it out in every county. They were going to start in Ocean, down to Central Jersey. They went up to Northern Jersey, down to Southern Jersey, and I think we trained Bergen County, Ocean County, Warren County, some of the other ones, and then it just kind of took off. And I think in 2017, I think I trained like 20 times, like in my car in hotel rooms, just teaching this thing, and that's how
Well,
that kind of started. Yeah.
so the interesting thing about the training, unlike I'm sure now, and Chrissy, maybe you can answer this because I'm not a CRISP trainer, so or I never
Mm-hmm.
took the CRISP. But I mean, medications come up.
Yeah.
I'm sure when you're working with peers now, but on the substance use side, we still weren't talking medications, right? Any kind of medications were mental health medications, which we still were not talking about.
Mhm.
That's right.
Where versus like the CRISP on the mental health side, that's more an accepted, medications are more accepted. I'm guessing. I'm asking, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so the short answer is yes, because the core training is teaching folks not just about mental health recovery, but about how to work as a peer in the existing mental health system, because these jobs pre-existed the training often. So you were almost reverse engineering what to put in the training as to like what are folks already doing, what do they need to know. So yes, you've got peers who are, it's super common. And as you all were talking, some of the things like, oh, folks thinking peers are going to take their jobs. We encounter that all the time too, where it's like, we don't
Yeah,
want
we
your
do.
job. And helping folks understand that peer support is not clinical and it's not treatment. That being said, yes, a lot of our training is around how to navigate coexisting in the system that already exists. So if you are working in the public mental health system with folks who have serious mental health issues, yeah, you're going to encounter folks who are on often a myriad of medications. So yeah, we talk about what is appropriate and not appropriate as far as peer supporters. And how to navigate that system, how to be an advocate, all of that. So the topic does come up. We talk all about what the existing mental health system looks like, how peers fit in, how we don't fit in. We go into
Uh,
all of that.
So it
a
and
big
so it is.
a big moment for me actually was when Chrissy and Bob Clay came to DMOS and they presented me with what they're doing as peers inside of a system, inside
Yeah.
a clinical system, and I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. The complement of it, and that really
And then
drove
it took
me to.
years before we put peers in the system. But
It took years and
and we
years.
still don't have a lot of peers in the
And
system,
it
but
No,
and it's listen, it is bumpy. It is not a smooth road. I mean,
right.
even
no.
even on the mental health side of things, it's still, I mean, some of the ways in which peer support is misunderstood just because we have a longer history. It's not, the misunderstanding is still very strong. There is
Yeah.
a systemic misunderstanding of what peer support is and what
Right.
its value is and what the lane is and is not.
Hmm.
And I think
But
as we got more into, Randy's asking a question about, what the approach, harm reduction, basically,
Yeah.
when, like, how did that come into it? And so now kind of remember we didn't call it, like I'm telling you, Patrick's
Oh,
always
well,
been harm reduction,
yeah.
but we never called it that. And that was some of the pushback that we got, right? Because
Big time.
And in fact, I got trained because I was a spy and wanted to know how I was being trained. So basically, that's why I got trained. Because I knew I wasn't going to be doing it as a position, but I was really interested in learning how people were being trained. And I got a lot of pushback in the training because I talked about, well, what you're saying about medication just doesn't sound right to me, right?
Hmm.
And so even people training were having a hard time accepting some of that,
Oh,
right?
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
sure, yeah.
Well, if I can give a plug and credit to where it's due to this core training, because we were actually talking before we started the webinar about, I know I took the training. Mike, you said you took it as well, right? Patrick, you were also in the CRSP
No,
training.
I didn't.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't take the CRISP training
Okay.
itself, but I was working with them. MHA got trained in the CPRS, and so
Okay. Well, back
yeah.
when we first started this, there was no other
There
certification,
was nothing else.
and
Right.
No.
we all luckily did take that training. And I think, I don't know anybody that hasn't come out of that training with a much deeper understanding, not only of the systems that they're walking into, but like how to effectively be in those systems. Like exactly what Chrissy was saying. Like every participant I know who's been through that training talks about like how important your own mental wellness is framed within working within these systems. And I think that that has immensely, um, that has helped us in our arc of, instead of like reinventing the wheel, of being able to take that and put it into the CPRS training.
Yeah.
Um, and also because coming from that end of things, medication of any kind has always been part of wellness and recovery. And like, I know Patrick and I have talked about how pushback has changed in trainings as trainers over the years. And in the beginning, the pushback was this multiple pathways to recovery. And that is what peer work is framed around. That was the phrase that,
Mm.
I mean, we still use the phrase, but it was it was an introduction for a lot of people to
Yeah.
lay the groundwork for the larger harm reduction movement that we are now living in that gets to be wrapped up into this, because harm reduction is part of a multiple pathway to recovery. So
Right.
was never excluded. To answer the specific question, Patrick did Patrick is in the process of updating the curriculum, and harm reduction is actually a separate section within the curriculum now.
Yes.
So it was taught in a different format, but now it actually gets to officially be part of the curriculum. So
Yeah.
that was in answer to the question that was in the...
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
And
that
not
new
to
man-
be
Go ahead, Matt.
not to be overly dramatic, but it was a revolutionary concept at that time. I
Mhm.
mean,
Yeah, it was.
18 years ago, the idea of multiple pathways and respecting all pathways was revolutionary. I mean, people, the pushback that we got was not just from the treatment community or from the state or from the counties or from the professionals. It was from the recovery community itself. So there was a lot of education that had to happen. And just to reinforce what you said, Heather, that the consumer connections training was an amazing training. I did go through that training, and all the information that I got out of that was information that I could easily apply to the SUD side. And all of our folks were able to do that. It was a really great training to have that then we were able to build on. So it was really great.
All right, so now we have 10 minutes to put in a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
I
this
was afraid of
conversation,
that.
this is a really important conversation, because it really does show like where we were, but where are we going, right? Patrick's already talked about like the changes that he's making. I'm going to turn off my screen for this part because I'm going to let you all do this, but my screen keeps kind of slowing down a little bit, so I want to turn my video off. And let you all speak about this. But I think, that this is the really important part, is where do we go from here? What kind of credentials are we looking to do? Like, are we looking at adding credentials, right? And, where do we go with the peer movement? So Patrick, you're gonna start off with talking about the rewrite that you're doing, and then
Yeah.
I'm gonna turn off my video.
So I wanted to rewrite the curriculum for a while, and last year ICNRC embraced the harm reduction model that was coming out of SAMHSA, which is hard to find anymore because the administration kind of took it all out. But so there is a domain 5 with the harm reduction. I think that, and I'm so blessed to have Heather and Kim go back helping me rewrite this thing, because they're giving me so much insight from the harm, because they know much more about harm reduction than I do. But the new manual's, I think, a lot more thorough with history, theory, the language changing, and then kind of just giving like what we've learned how to teach and what people need to know. In terms of the history and some theory, and then new practices. And I think Heather might have more to say about the harm reduction changes that we're making, because they're teaching me a whole lot on that.
Yes, I'll jump in. It's an honor to be working on this curriculum that I've been able to be training now for. I don't know, the curriculum's been around for 10 years. We've been certifying for 8, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I know this curriculum very well because I teach it. So it's really awesome to be able to say this part doesn't work quite as well. This part is definitely outdated, because this is the middle of a movement. Like we should be updating things like language and updating things like research and updating things like where we're getting this information from. So part of it was wanting to keep it in the harm reduction piece was wanting to keep it in the same vein as the other parts of the curriculum. So keep in mind, this is just meant as an introductory to get you to certification piece. Something we've talked about over the years has been there needs to be more specialized training for peers once they are in certain roles, because this is just a generalized training for any peer that wants to be a peer in the field. But there should be specialized trainings for people going into hospital settings, or people going into community settings, or people going into recovery centers. Like, it's a different, there's overlap, but there's absolutely different skill sets that will work best in different places. So I have been kind of preaching the gospel of harm reduction in New Jersey for about 10 years. I was not on board with harm reduction when I first got into recovery, and many of us were not. And
I was not.
I say that openly because I want people to know, like, as we learn more, we do more, and as we know better, we do better.
Yeah.
And you're allowed to change your mind on these things when you're presented with new information and new studies. And for those of us that identify as being people in recovery in any way, shape, or form, unfortunately, we've all lost a lot of people. And no matter what we would put into place, like, it just seemed like we kept losing people. And then I was instructed by people who knew a lot more about me than I did about harm reduction, which has been around for forever. This is not a new thing. It's just something that we are newer to learning about and applying in these particular ways in the substance use field. So I am lucky enough to be able to work on rolling out more harm reduction and more harm reduction programs in a similar fashion to when I was advocating for recovery centers. I just took the skill set and moved on to the topic that's helping people most now. So it's not going to be the, practical nuts and bolts of harm reduction. That is something that you get once you are out in the field. This is just about making sure you understand where harm reduction comes from, why it's so important, and the philosophy behind it, which in some of the places we're calling relational harm reduction now. So the foundational piece of harm reduction, because what we have discovered is people can be very easily taught how to do harm reduction stuff, like give things out or distribute things. But if you don't have the right kind of love and idea behind meeting that person where they are, you can do more harm than save people from harm. So we are adamant that we are getting across in this new curriculum, like making sure that people are going in there in the right space, in the right brain and heart space to be meeting people literally where they are, which is why it wraps so nicely into this particular training.
Yep.
Okay. And I think, so I guess the question is too, where do we go as far as other certifications?
Well, one of the things,
any
I'll say
parts?
that one of the things that we're working on, the GSAR, which is the Garden State Alliance for Recovery Residences, we're currently working on a curriculum, which is actually finished. We're looking to get it approved, which is for house managers, house operators, because again, it's a specific way of providing recovery support services. And that we're hoping that we'll be able to start providing that training. It covers all the ethics and boundary issues, emergency preparedness, because almost anything can, just like in any household, anything can happen. Really clearly defining what the role is for house managers, recovery residents, operators. Really creating that recovery-oriented environment and dealing with conflict resolution, which is going to happen when you have a bunch of people living in a house, right? So it's a really comprehensive training specifically for house managers and recovery operators. So it's something we're working on at GSAR.
I would like to jump in and say, like, on some of the lessons learned that we've had, I know that we had a lot of conversations in the beginning of this movement when we're talking about the way back. William White warned us about the
Yes, he did. Yes.
over clinicalization of peers. And I do want to say, unfortunately, I do see a lot of that today. And this is something that with redoing the curriculum and the CERT board and the IC and RC, we have been advocating to try and tamp this down, because I don't want to, he used to talk about peers losing their peerness a lot.
Yes.
And I find that sometimes when we do exactly what Chris was saying, with like, we already have people in the workforce, now we got to kind of go back and pull some of it in.
Yeah.
Um, we want to be able to make sure that peers are still able to maintain their peerness while adhering to the ethics and boundaries that they are certified and taught about, but
Hmm.
also letting the rest of the system know, like, what is the role of a peer, making sure we're not putting other roles on top of them. And the one that I will always advocate for, I have not changed this in all of these years, is to remember that our peer workforce, myself included, we are the clientele that we serve, and we need support. We need good supervision. We need good support structures. We need people to who are employing peers to remember that um, we're not just there to kind of fill in the gap. We're there to provide a vital service that
Hmm.
peers are unique for. Like, I've seen people be able to bond with a peer worker in a way that they couldn't bond with anybody else. And I worry about our peer workforce burning out. We've been doing this long enough now that I'm seeing some people start to leave the field. So now, instead of hey, we got all of the recovery centers. We do have one in every county.
We finally do.
um, and now we're doing the same thing with the harm reduction centers. We've got them in a lot of different areas in the state. Thank God. So this is one of the things, though, that I still advocate for repeatedly, is making sure that peers know their rights, that they, you know, advocate for supports and training within the systems that they work in. Really.
And I
And
just
I,
And
want to
And what
jump in and just speak to that a little bit because what Heather said is so on the money. And it's when we revised our curriculum, one of the things I said was obviously everything we're teaching we think is important. But at the end of the day, if you forget everything that I taught you, but you walk out knowing what peer support is, knowing what your role is, and knowing how to advocate for yourself so that that co-optation and peer drift doesn't happen, then that's enough of a start for me because it comes from both directions. I think sometimes we have peers who do get into these jobs and they want to take on more and more because there has been this stigmatizing lens that you're only important if you are a clinician. Um, but then there's the system that is co-opting peer support and likes to call it peer support and then slowly transition folks into doing more and more clinical work and eroding their role. So it is so important that peers walk away knowing what peer support is and is not, so that they can adequately stay in their lane and then, yes, have that support.
I think
and
it's
I
equally and maybe even more important that the people who hire peers
Yes.
mm,
understand
Yes.
what the
yeah,
what the peer role is,
Yes.
uh, and understand how to provide supervision to peers. I think training is great, and I've always been supportive of training. I do think we have to be careful about over credentialing. Uh, as William White did write, that the professionalism in the treatment field, which drove a lot of people with lived experience out of the treatment field, is what created the gap that we have to fill with peers now. So I think we want to be careful about that, but making sure that the folks that hire, the organizations that hire peers, really understand the peer role and know how to provide supervision is key. I think is key.
Yes.
I
So,
think
like we want
there
to keep updating. I think it's great that we're updating the trainings, but we also
Yes.
need to make sure that we get all those organizations trained appropriately as well.
Absolutely. We do a lot of technical assistance for organizations, and I can't tell you how many folks are employing peers and they have no idea what the
No
role is
idea.
of the people that they're
absolutely.
employing. They don't know
Absolutely.
how to
yeah
And Jake,
supervise. They don't
yeah,
know what
no
there's so much education that needs to happen
yeah.
from that higher level.
and I think
Patrick, do
so.
you
I
want to
know
add?
Yeah, I know that the ICNRC, from what I understand, is trying to develop a peer supervision credential that the
Mhm.
CERT board's very interested in implementing. So, but it hasn't been written yet, and it's kind of like in the wind still, trying to figure out how to do it. But of course, what was happening was we were getting clinical folks had no idea what peers were supervising peers, and it was a very disconnect. And I think
Yeah.
yeah, Mike is right about that. Yeah,
Hey,
we
listen,
need
I'm a
some.
clinician. I've been one for 40 years. There's an arrogance that if I'm a social worker or a licensed clinical alcohol and drug counselor, and I've been supervising people for the last 20 years, that I know how to supervise peers. And the
Yep.
fact is, our experience is that most don't.
Yeah.
So,
The one
we do
Right.
HHRs, we do provide a lot of technical assistance to organizations, and that's one of the things that we consistently find that they really aren't clear about what the role is, and how to
Hmm.
provide supervision.
Well,
anytime peer decisions should be made are being made about peers, peers should be at the table. You
right.
should be
Absolutely.
asking that.
Absolutely.
As
Absolutely.
you can see, this part of the movement was built on peers.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So the next part of the movement needs to be as well.
So, and we should have made this an hour and a half because this could go on for a long time, this conversation, and there's a lot more to be said. I did, just so you all know too, on June, what is that, 8th, we're going to do another webinar with Chad Sabora, who's known nationally for his work with peers. Did some work with SAMHSA. It'll be an interesting conversation because it will be ways for employers to kind of have a better understanding of, how to write policy for their peer employees, right? Because I think that's part of the problem is that, we need somebody that can really help with that understands peers. So that'll be June 8th at 1 o'clock. We'll have that. But this has been a great conversation, and I think you cleared up a lot of the history. But more importantly is like where we go from here. Because I think peers are going to stay. We
Oh
hope that we
yeah.
continue funding, and right now we're an okay as far as opioid settlement funding to keep this going, and hopefully we'll continue to get some federal funding down the road too to keep doing the work that we're doing. But peers are a really important piece in
Oh yeah.
in recovery. So, any last
And peer.
comments, quick, because we're really late?
Well, I think
Anything?
peers are the wave of the future. I mean, this is peers are essential. I think providing a service that is not provided elsewhere. Um, the connection that happens between a peer specialist and a participant is a very special role. And I think we have to really, hold on to that. And I remember Pat Deegan said, "Beware the undertow of assimilation." And I think that's what we also have to worry about is we are not clinicians, we are not social workers, we are peers, and
What a
really
great
hanging
way
on
to
to
end. But that's a great, could have written any better. All right. Thank you all for being here. And we will send a copy to anybody that registered. We'll get a copy of the video. Thank you all for the
Thank you
turn.
for having me.
Yeah, thank
Thanks.
you.
Thanks so much.